the research type people have been asked to present a journal club. So the research update is actually more of a research, it's basically a journal club. And one of the reasons is I'll go through the next slide. So I sent around this article last week. I'll go through why I think the article is interesting shortly. But I guess one of the questions one of the questions is why do a journal club? So and what is actually a journal club? And so a journal club really looks at how a paper answers a question rather than looking at a specific question. So I think a lot of people, when people present papers, want someone to say, hey, look, here's a life-changing paper that's done perfectly. That's never the case. So there's very few papers that would completely change your practice, and there's also a lot of papers that can add information, but a bit of understanding of some of the limitations and why the paper's done in such a way helps. So that's what a journal club actually is. So I think a lot of people, if they dial into a journal club hoping to learn something about a topic, get very disappointed, but that's not what a journal club is. A journal club is about discussing a paper and having a look at it, and the reason is to go beyond just accepting the abstract when you read papers, and also to have a look at some study designs, review some statistics, and the more of them you do, the more comfortable you feel when you're reading papers in the future. And the other reason is the more comfortable you feel, the more likely you are to become a peer reviewer. So peer review is very important for medicine and for academic medicine. And a peer reviewer is exactly that. It's a peer, right? So it's not a scientific reviewer, it's not a statistical reviewer, it's a peer reviewer. So it's whether what you've done makes sense to a peer, and that's actually very important. And anyone can do a peer review if you are a peer. And every time I say peer, it sounds more and more like I'm talking about the fruit. But and so you don't have to have an in-depth stats knowledge. And hopefully the very last slide of this will show you what I'm talking about. So when I read a paper, my approach is as follows. So it's a paper I'm interested in. So first of all, I read the abstract. If it's a paper that I'm interested in, I always go straight to the figures, not figures and tables. I have a look at those. And I'll show you why in a second, because they'll often tell you a lot about the paper. And figures and tables should stand alone. So you can get a lot of information out of figures and tables. I then have a quick look at the methods, and then I read the results. And then I apply a critical appraisal tool. They're actually quite easy. I think most of us get taught the CAS tools, which are really, really annoying when we're at medical school, but there's other ones out there that actually make life a lot easier. And then if I don't understand something, I go and I look it up, right? But I don't do that for every single paper. It's only the papers that I'm truly interested in. So this paper was published in August in the American Journal of Emergency Medicine. That's a reasonable journal. The other thing is also to pay attention to the particular journal. This is a reasonable journal. And I also look at where the study was done, just out of curiosity. So this was actually done out of Turkey. I don't know if anyone's been to Izmir. It's a really good kite surfing location. And it's a comparison of carotid artery ultrasound and manual method, which is obviously a manual finger on the pulse check in cardiopulmonary resuscitation. The reason I'm interested in this, or the motivating case, was actually a patient I had several years ago. It was a 37-year-old with Rett syndrome. That's actually quite old to have Rett syndrome. I've been looked after very well and loved very deeply by her family. And she presented with this aspiration and a hypoxia event, and she rested on induction when we induced her in the emergency department. We did prolonged CPR with and had a low end-tidal CO2, but no palpable pulse really at any stage. And we're about to call it. We're going to bring the family through, but we're just convinced that there wasn't actually ROSC, because just that we felt that we couldn't detect it. So I asked the ED physician just to do an ultrasound of the femoral artery, and we noticed that a pulse was actually very present. We just couldn't palpate the pulses for some reason. And so compressions were stopped. We gave fluids and adrenaline and got like sustained ROSC with further palpable pulses. And she was eventually extubated in the ICU. We wrote it up as a case report because we use the ultrasound for pulse check, not manual method. But they're like, this is 8 years ago now. And subsequent to that, I didn't really know if that was the right thing to do or not. So if you go through the literature, manual pulse checks actually perform very poorly in simulated PEA. So if you have someone on ECMO or bypass, you blind the people as to whether or not the person is on on bypass or not. So when you're on bypass, you don't have a pulsatile pulse. You've just got flow, and ask them. It's actually quite inaccurate as to whether people call whether there's a pulse present or not. There's lots of papers out on that. With an ultrasound assessment, you can visually inspect the artery. A lot of us do it all the time because we're trying to not hit the artery and put a central line in. So actually very good at identifying arteries, and but we're unclear how reliable or valid it was or is. So at St George, we actually conducted 2 studies, but these we would like to have done a clinical study, but we knew we couldn't because we didn't have any basic information. So we just did 2 studies aiming to just help design a clinical study. So we looked at the reliability of carotid ultrasound and determining the return of pulsatile flow. And this was done again in bypass patients. So when they're on bypass, they have no pulse. When they're off bypass, they have a pulse. And we just wanted to check if people could tell the difference. And the reliability refers to whether people who are rating the same thing agree or not. So there's actually 3 raters here, and you can see the agreement's not too bad if you just look at the visually. Like, even though we're all slightly wrong, we all agree except for this one, and not so much here, I guess. But for a lot of the times we actually agreed as to what we were seeing. All right, but there was quite a difference sometimes, up to a minute, between when a pulse returned and whether we could detect it. But we were as bad or as good as each other. So that means if 3 different people are reviewing the screen, then they're likely to at least agree, even if they're all wrong. And so then we did a subsequent study where we actually looked at the validity, so whether we agree and whether we're measuring the correct thing. And we found that actually carotid ultrasound could actually was a reasonably valid method. There should have been a picture here, I apologize. That was going to illustrate that. But again, these were on bypass patients and patients who are not a clinical study. And so I've kept an eye on the literature out of curiosity whether anyone had followed this through. So that's why I found this particular paper interesting. So this particular paper assessed the performance of 2 diagnostic tests against a common gold standard in real cardiac arrest patients. So that's why I thought it was interesting. It's a binary diagnostic test accuracy study. So we're talking about sensitivities and specificities. So we're talking about yes and no. We're not talking about whether these 2 tests were measuring something that could be on a continuous scale. So if you were comparing something like end-tidal CO2 to PaCO2, those are numbers that could be anything from 0 to 100, and you would do different types of statistics on those. But this is sensitivity and specificity because we've got a yes pulse present, no pulse absent. And it's a paired design, so both tests were on the same patient, and that does affect your statistics just a little. And what I'm expecting when I see the study is a 2x2 table. I'm expecting to see comparisons of sensitivity and specificity. And that can be by McNemar's test, and that's because this particular test you use if you've got a paired design. So if you're using the same patient, you use McNemar's test. If there was measured in a different patient, then you would use just a standard t-test. And another thing, or I'm expecting Newton's index or an RSE curve. So this is what I'm expecting when I read the paper. And if I see something different, it sort of, I guess, either piques my interest or makes me a bit suspicious. So the critical appraisal tool I also used was this one from Joanna Briggs Institute. So JBI is a large organization based in South Australia, but globally respected. And they produce a whole lot of critical appraisal tools. And I find them far more user-friendly than the ones that sort of come out of Oxford. So I go to this website and have a look, and you'll see because it's actually quite short. So the paper in brief, it's observational, so it was not randomized. It was a daytime study. So it was to do the study, they needed 3 clinicians present. They needed 1 to run the cardiac arrest. This is 3 clinicians / study investigators. So you needed 1 to run the cardiac arrest as per normal, and you needed 1 to do the ultrasound and decide whether a pulse was present or not during the pulse checks, and another one to independently palpate the carotid pulse on the other side and make their own decision. So you can see it's resource intensive. There's 3 measures: manual pulse, carotid ultrasound, and the team leader decision. And the team leader made a decision based on ECG, capnography, manual femoral pulse check, and cardiac ultrasound. So here you just have 1 measure, finger on the pulse. Here you have 1 measure, and this person's integrating all of this, right, as to whether or not they think there's pulse present. The team leader's decision was considered to be the gold standard, and against that, the other 2 were measured. These decisions on whether the manual pulse or the carotid ultrasound pulse were made without waiting for the team leader decision. and they time-stamped the time that they made their decision. And they did their comparison by difference in sensitivity and specificity, a method called Newton's method, which I'd never heard, and looking at the difference in decision-making times. So when we apply the critical appraisal tool, and the critical appraisal tool is quite useful because it asks questions I probably wouldn't have. Was it the consecutive or random sample of patients? And it wasn't consecutive, and it wasn't a random sample. It was only during working hours, and we'll see the effect of that shortly. And it was non-consecutive. It was non-consecutive and not random at all. So if the 3 people weren't available, then they didn't conduct the study. Was a case control design avoided? And that's a case control is when you know the outcome and then you go backwards and study the test. And yes-ish, because the team's leader's decision was apparently not known at the time that the other people made their decision, but that isn't actually reported. So it is possible that the team leader made a decision before the other 2 actually wrote down their decision. And so you've got this, which potentially then becomes actually a retrospective process. And did they avoid inappropriate exclusions? Kind of. Except I always think these maybe not pregnant women, but the rest of the stuff is associated with an aging population, which are the people at risk of having a heart attack. So it is possible that they excluded some interesting patients. Were the index tests interpreted without knowledge of the results of the reference standard? And the answer is possible, because they was to make the decision independently, timestamp them without discussing with the team leader. Was the threshold used or pre-specified? The answer is not really applicable here. And is the reference standard likely to classify the target condition? So remember that the decision of whether ROSC was present or not was made by a team leader based on all of these things, right? And so I think the important thing here is we don't know which of these he made his decision on. And we could have sometimes been actually comparing a femoral pulse check to a carotid pulse check, or we may have been comparing a cardiac ultrasound to a carotid ultrasound. So it wasn't actually recorded which one of these was used or important for the team leader. Oops, I said that already. Was there appropriate interval between the index test and reference standards? Yes. Did all patients receive the same reference standard? It's unclear, because we don't know on each individual patient what was actually used to decide on ROSC. And all patients included in the analysis, and that is no. So I'm going to go on to the next slide. So this is their flowchart of patients. The thing I find kind of interesting is there were 600 patients available to the study. They included this number here, so they had 528. Most patients were admitted outside the working hours, so most of their cardiac arrests occur after hours. So they only end up with a sample size of 49. So if you think of going from 608 potential, or maybe 528, all the way down to 49, there's quite a loss of these patients. So we don't know whether these might have been different. 595 pulse check intervals. So we've got multiple measures on single patients. That's actually okay. VF and pulseless VT developed in 27 of these pulse check intervals. So these patients were actually excluded because they actually gained ROSC during the assessment of ROSC. So both manual and carotid ultrasound checks were performed 568. So they got 568 to put into their 2x2 table. And so trying to click the button. Here we go. So this is a 2x2 table, and this is why I say go straight to the tables, because there is something interesting in the way the data is presented. The rest of it's quite straightforward. There's nothing too unexpected, but these numbers, the n actually, the denominator actually changes as you go through the table. So if you actually read this on face value, it doesn't make any sense. And the reason I say that's interesting is it sort of talks to the writing up in general and the thought processes of the people when they're publishing it, and that this should have been split out. And the fact that the n doesn't change, or it's not really clear, makes me not suspicious, but makes you think about the way the rest of the data is presented, because it's just, I guess it's not tidy, put it that way. So these are the sensitivity and specificities. We've got manual pulse check on the left, carotid ultrasound on the right. And with sensitivity specificity, and unfortunately that's buried in here, but sensitivity and specificity in 80 and 90 for manual pulse check, and 100% sensitivity and 98% sensitivity for the carotid ultrasound. So on face value, looks good. this looks like to be the better method. And these are the times. So clinical judgment, basically 6 seconds, 3 seconds. Again, 6 seconds, 3 seconds. This is reported as statistically significant in the abstract, but if you think about it, it's not. Like, it's 0.2 of a second. Sorry, statistically significant, but it's not clinically significant. So it takes about the same amount of time to do the check. And I think that's actually important for the interpretation as well. And this is the other thing. The prevalence affects the negative and positive predictive value. And the prevalence here is actually only 6% of ROSC. So when you talk about sensitivities and specificities, although they're supposed to be prevalence, they're supposed to be insensitive to prevalence. They're not entirely when you're designing a study, because you actually only have something like 37 ROSC positives times you can say call that there's a pulse when there is a pulse. That's actually quite a small number. When you think of the negatives, it's quite imbalanced. And the reason I say that, hopefully it comes up on the next, if it doesn't come up on the side, it's going to come up shortly. And then the other question I have is, what is important when you're doing a study like this? And I think it's negative and it's not negative. In cardiac arrest, that's important. Another diagnostic test it may not be, but in cardiac arrest, if you say there is ROSC and there isn't ROSC, you would stop CPR in a patient who requires CPR, if that makes sense. And so here we said there's a pulse, but there wasn't one only 6 times in the carotid ultrasound, whereas you got sort of this 50, right? So in a way, the study should be powered for this specificity more than sensitivity. So they reported Cohen's K and reliability. I'm actually going to flick through that. This is what they reported here. I won't go. It doesn't seem appropriate to use Cohen's K in this situation, because Cohen K is normally about looking at rate of agreement than it has to do with diagnostic test agreement. So they report it, but I would ignore it. The other thing is Uden index, and that's sensitivity plus specificity -1. So this is like a recognized way of comparing diagnostic tests, and you can see, and you sort of read it similar to a correlation coefficient. So you can see 0.98, that's actually pretty good for carotid ultrasound and manual. It's much less, but you can't do a statistical test on this without the raw data. So they didn't report this, I just did this myself, but as a quick screen. But it'd be better if they report it. So they used this other method called Newcomb's method, and Newcomb's method was described in 2001. So this is when I say, if you don't know something, go look it up. So I went and looked it up, found the paper, and they looked at comparing sensitivity and specificity of 2 tests in a paired design, a straightforward graphical approach. So that would make sense if you read that title, that this would be the appropriate study to do it. The problem is this is how you report it, and this is, to me, unreadable. So the difference in sensitivities was this negative number with 4 decimal places, and the specificities was this number with 4 decimal places with this unreadable confidence interval. And so Newcomb describes in his paper this graphical method where you plot the difference in sensitivities and the difference in specificities, and you produce a 95% confidence interval, and you don't want it to cross 0. And so his point is that with this plot, you should be able to basically eyeball and decide whether a test is good. So ideally, the confidence interval shouldn't cross 0. So that's no useful difference in this test, because this one, the confidence interval goes either side of 0, and this is equivalent test because actually the differences in sensitivity and specificities always lie on 0. But going further than that, so this is the graph that appears in the paper, and again, it's kind of unreadable, because the important thing is whether the confidence interval crosses 0, and you can't actually see it. You kind of can, but it's kind of here somewhere. The other thing is there's this lambda value, and this is their description of lambda, and this is, I just cut and pasted this from the original paper, and my point is it's unreadable. I have no idea what they're talking about. And I think if you're trying to communicate in a paper something to clinicians, this is not useful. Unfortunately, that this needed to be better interpreted. What lambda, it turns out, my interpretation of lambda is you work out where this difference is important according to prevalence or something. But my point is I tried very hard and I couldn't work it out. And based on on the way the other results were presented back here, I'm not entirely convinced the authors knew either what it was, because otherwise it would be written in very clear English. So the final statistic they produced was the manual method yielded Roche's decision in 3 seconds and the carotid ultrasound in 2.8 seconds, therefore being statistically significant. I think pretty much everyone in the audience. I mean, none of us can actually work out what 200 milliseconds is anyway, if we asked you to. So I personally can't see that as actually being clinically important, except that it doesn't take any longer. And I think that's important. So using an ultrasound method doesn't take any longer than using a Roche decision. But in a way, it appears that the ultrasound method is more accurate, especially in terms of specificity. So, conclusions. So my conclusions, time to decision is not clinically faster between the methods, but I actually think it's a good thing, not a bad thing. By Uden's index, crudely, the carotid ultrasound may be the better test. I think their gold standard is unfortunately questionable, although practical. I think ideally what you would do is put an outline in all of these patients as soon as they arrive. But what I am saying, but I don't actually think that's practical. So this is their gold standard was practical, but not very good from a research point of view. This is really good from research view, but almost impractical. So it would have been better if they kind of reported what they were actually making their decisions on. There's potential for selection bias, especially by time of day and mortality rates. And more work is needed. Because my question is often, should you combine the two methods, have one person putting their hand on the femoral pulse and another person doing an ultrasound and actually make a decision? Because that's probably in real life what you would do. You would never just use one. And in fact, their gold standard, they incorporated 5 different measures to decide. And admittedly, they took 6 seconds, whereas the carotid ultrasound decision was made within 3 seconds. So I think for me, this is the most important slide, because what we want is everyone in the audience to volunteer to be peer reviewers for academic journals and also for grants, right? So what I'm sort of trying to slowly demonstrate, or we will hopefully slowly demonstrate, is you don't need to know detailed stats to be a peer reviewer. So my thing is that I'd give that paper actually an 8 out of 10, because I think it was an honest and pragmatic attempt to answer the question that it proposed. So I wouldn't reject that paper. But what I would say is that I suggest they use a more modern comparison rather than this UKIMS method, or they need to explain lambda or the whole method in detail, or redraw their figures, because it's probably very interesting. It may be completely accurate, but it's completely uninterpretable what they've done. I would remove the comparison of assessment times, or at least comment that while statistically significant, they weren't clinically significant, or more importantly, they weren't different, and that's actually a good thing. I would want to know the statistical power, specifically for sensitivity to prevalence of 6%, because there weren't that in all those measures, there weren't many conditions where a patient had a pulse and a pulse was reported, yet there was sort of 100 times negative conditions. And I would just add to limitations that we are not sure which aspect of the gold standard contributed to decision making and the importance of that, because there were times where we may have during the study actually been measuring 2 methods of pulse manual palpation, or 2 methods of ultrasound. And that is the end of the Journal Club. Any questions?